Young woman left for her lunch break, but she never came back. At first, her coworkers thought maybe she was just running late, maybe an errand took longer than expected. But as the hours passed and there was still no sign of her, that quiet concern turned into panic. They called her phone over and over, but there was no answer. And when the police finally got involved, what they uncovered felt less like a workplace mystery and more like the plot of a horror film. Piece by piece, detectives began to unravel the truth. Carolyn Byington was born on May 30th, 1993, in Plainsboro, New Jersey. She grew up there with her parents and older sister, a tight-knit family who always encouraged her curiosity and her dreams of seeing the world. From a young age, Carolyn knew she wanted to experience life beyond her hometown. After high school, she attended Lafayette College, where she took full advantage of every opportunity. She studied abroad in both Japan and Germany, and somehow, she managed to earn 3 bachelor's degrees in international affairs, sociology, and anthropology. After graduating in 2015, she landed a job at a local marketing firm not far from home. Rather than moving away, Carolyn chose to rent an apartment right there in Plainsboro so she could stay close to her family. Outside of work, she gave back to her community, volunteering with a youth league and supporting local charities. Friends described her as kind, ambitious, and always on the move. She loved traveling, learning, and making a difference wherever she went. By 2019, at just 26 years old, Carolyn had built a good life for herself. A stable job, a circle of friends, and a future that seemed bright. But on June 10th, everything changed. That afternoon, Carolyn decided to head home for lunch. Something she didn't usually do. She told her coworkers she'd be back shortly, but she never returned. As the day went on, no one could reach her. Calls went unanswered. Texts were left unread. It just didn't make sense. Carolyn was known for being responsible, dependable. This wasn't like her. By early evening, her coworkers couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. So they called the police and asked them to check on her. Around 6 p.m., officers arrived at her apartment. The front door was unlocked. They stepped inside and were met with a scene no one could ever forget. When officers entered Carolyn's apartment, they were met with a horrific sight. She was lying on the floor, and the sheer amount of blood around her made it instantly clear she was gone. As the medical examiner began examining her body, detectives got to work, securing the scene, gathering evidence, and knocking on doors in search of anyone who might have seen or heard something. One neighbor mentioned that around noon, he'd heard a scream, sharp, quick, and unsettling. Not long after, there were strange noises coming from Carolyn's apartment, like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor. But no one reported seeing any unfamiliar faces that day. And unfortunately, the building didn't have security cameras. Inside, the scene offered very few clues. Whoever did this had tried to clean up. The smell of bleach lingered in the air. It was clear the killer had made an effort to erase their tracks. Those noises the neighbor heard, most likely the sound of someone trying to hide the evidence of what they'd just done. While investigators searched nearby buildings for any surveillance footage and chased down every possible lead, the medical examiner finalized the autopsy. The results were brutal. Carolyn had suffered multiple blunt force injuries to the head, likely from being punched repeatedly. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, she'd also been stabbed several times in the neck with both a pair of scissors and a screwdriver. Both items came from inside her own apartment. There were no signs of sexual assault. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, which meant this wasn't about money. And it wasn't random, it was personal. The sheer level of violence, the rage behind every wound, told investigators that this killer wasn't a stranger. This was someone who knew Carolyn, someone who hated her enough to want her to suffer. Detectives started interviewing her family, friends, and coworkers, anyone who might have known her well. But no one could think of a single person who'd ever wanted to hurt her. Everyone described her the same way: kind, gentle, and always willing to help others. There didn't seem to be a single clue pointing to why this had happened, or who could possibly have done it. At first, detectives had nothing. Carolyn wasn't seeing anyone. She didn't have a messy breakup, a jealous ex, or any known enemies. By all accounts, her life was calm and ordinary, so investigators shifted their focus to her workplace. And that's when things started to get interesting. They discovered that on the same day Carolyn left the office for her lunch break, another employee also left around that same time. A 30-year-old man named Kenneth Saul. At first, that detail didn't seem like much. Lots of people step out during lunch, right? But what caught detectives' attention was that Kenneth didn't come back to the office until hours later. When his manager asked about it, Kenneth claimed he'd had car trouble, said he needed to stop by a repair shop. Seemed reasonable, until the manager decided to double-check his story. The shop had no record of him ever showing up. That's when coworkers started remembering little things. Things that didn't sit right. When Kenneth finally returned to the office, he looked nervous. He kept fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, and they noticed scratches on his hands, deep enough to stand out. Then, during what seemed like a casual chat, Kenneth asked a strange question. He wanted to know if someone could be arrested just based on circumstantial evidence. That one line sent chills down people's spines, and it definitely got the detectives' attention. They dug deeper into his life. Kenneth was an accountant, married with a baby girl who'd just turned 1. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, nothing to suggest he was capable of something like this. But there were too many red flags to ignore. When police brought him in for questioning, Kenneth stuck to his story, said he'd gone to the repair shop during lunch. But when detectives asked for proof, a receipt, a text, anything, he came up empty-handed. And then, suddenly, his story changed. Now he claimed he hadn't gone to a repair shop after all. Instead, he said he'd fixed his car himself, at a nearby park. That abrupt change, the inconsistency, the hesitation, it set off alarm bells. Detectives knew they were getting closer to the truth. For detectives, the fact that Kenneth's story changed at all was a major red flag. People don't usually forget where they spent their lunch hour, especially when a murder investigation is involved. And what made it even stranger? Kenneth was an accountant. Not exactly the kind of guy you'd picture fixing a car in a park by himself, instead of taking it to a professional mechanic. The whole thing just didn't add up. Still, Kenneth denied having anything to do with Carolyn's death. And at that point, police didn't have enough solid evidence to make an arrest. But that was about to change. While combing through surveillance footage from nearby businesses, investigators decided to take a closer look at dashcam video from a police patrol car that had passed through the area shortly after noon. And there it was, clear as day, Kenneth's car. The same make, same license plate, caught on camera just a few miles from Carolyn's apartment complex. The problem? That area was 6 miles away from his office. Kenneth had told police he was fixing his car at a park near work, but this footage proved otherwise. He was nowhere near that park, he was near her home. It wasn't enough for an arrest yet, but it seriously tightened the noose. Then came another discovery, this time from the autopsy. Medical examiners found tiny fragments of skin underneath Carolyn's fingernails. That told investigators something chilling. She had fought back. And Kenneth? He had fresh scratches all over his hands, injuries he couldn't quite explain. Unfortunately, the DNA under Carolyn's nails wasn't enough to build a full profile. So even though detectives collected Kenneth's DNA for comparison, the results came back inconclusive. It didn't confirm he was the killer, but it didn't clear him either. Still, that was enough for investigators to keep him under a microscope. They were confident Kenneth was responsible. They just needed one more piece, something definitive, to close the case. But as weeks passed, nothing new surfaced. And the longer it dragged on, the more it seemed like Kenneth might actually get away with it. Eventually, detectives brought everything they had to the district attorney. After reviewing all the evidence, every report, every lead, the DA decided there was finally enough to take a chance. The case was still built on circumstantial evidence, sure, but it was strong circumstantial evidence, maybe strong enough to convince a jury. So 2 months after Carolyn's murder, police arrested Kenneth and took him into custody to await trial. But just when it seemed like things were finally falling into place, the case took a turn no one saw coming. While detectives were still building their case, they received a letter from the county jail, written by Kenneth's cellmate, and what was inside that letter would change everything. According to the inmate, Kenneth had offered him $15,000 to carry out a murder once he was released. And this wasn't some vague threat. It was a fully detailed plan, down to the weapons, the victim, and even the cleanup. Kenneth wanted the target to be a random woman, somewhere between 25 and 30 years old. He told his cellmate to use a screwdriver and a pair of scissors, the same weapons used to kill Carolyn, and to stab the victim in the neck. Then, he said, clean the scene with bleach. Detectives were stunned. Those details, the exact weapons, the bleach, everything, had never been released to the public. Only the killer would have known that. That's when it hit them. Kenneth was trying to stage a copycat killing. His plan was to make it look like a serial killer was on the loose, one who just happened to use the same weapons and methods. Since Kenneth would already be behind bars when the second murder took place, he probably thought police would rule him out completely and shift their investigation somewhere else. But the letter didn't stop there. According to the cellmate, Kenneth also floated an even darker idea. He said the inmate could either kill the lead detective on the case or target someone police had already interviewed. If he chose the second option, Kenneth told him to stage the scene to look like the victim had taken their own life, and to leave behind a fake confession note claiming responsibility for Carolyn's murder. The goal? To make police believe the real killer had confessed and died, clearing Kenneth's name and setting him free. It was a twisted, almost cinematic plan, but it revealed exactly the kind of mind they were dealing with. When it came to Kenneth's plan to kill the lead detective, no one could quite figure out what he thought would happen next. It seemed he genuinely believed that without the main investigator, the entire case would just fall apart. And as if that weren't absurd enough, Kenneth actually started giving his cellmate advice on how to avoid getting caught, as if he wasn't already sitting in a jail cell. The entire scheme was so ridiculous, it almost sounded like something out of a bad movie. But the scariest part? Kenneth wasn't joking. He was dead serious. He really thought this plan would set him free. After uncovering the details, detectives saw an opportunity. They asked the inmate to wear a wire and casually bring up the topic again in conversation. The inmate agreed. Not long after, investigators were listening to crystal-clear recordings of Kenneth calmly discussing plans to have multiple people murdered. The very same day, prison staff searched Kenneth's cell, and what they found was chilling. Hidden among his belongings were several handwritten notes confessing to Carolyn's murder. These weren't genuine admissions of guilt. Kenneth had written them to be planted next to the body of whoever his cellmate was supposed to kill. Fake suicide notes meant to make someone else take the blame. He must have thought no one would bother to compare the handwriting. With that discovery, investigators suddenly had far more than circumstantial evidence. They now had written confessions, recorded conversations, and a clear conspiracy, all pointing straight back to Kenneth. Not only did this strengthen the case against him for Carolyn's murder, but it also added new charges for conspiracy to commit murder. Even so, one thing still didn't make sense. Why? Why had Kenneth killed Carolyn in the first place? For years, detectives could only speculate, but eventually they got their answer, and it was something no one expected. Kenneth remained in jail for several years. Then, in November 2022, 3 years after his arrest, prosecutors made a strategic decision. Despite all the evidence, they still didn't have a definitive DNA match, no fingerprints, no single piece of physical proof tying him directly to the scene. Taking the case to trial could be risky. So, they offered him a deal. If Kenneth agreed to confess to Carolyn's murder, they'd reduce his sentence. And to everyone's disbelief, he accepted. During his confession, Kenneth revealed that he'd started working at the company back in 2016, 3 years before the murder. That's where Kenneth first met Carolyn, and over time, something started to change, at least for him. Even though he was married, he developed romantic feelings for her. But Carolyn didn't feel the same way. She made that perfectly clear. Still, Kenneth refused to accept it. On the surface, he played it off, quiet, professional, pretending to move on. But beneath that calm exterior, his obsession was growing. Slowly, quietly, until it became something darker. Eventually, it turned into stalking. At some point, Kenneth managed to steal Carolyn's house key, just long enough to make a copy, before slipping the original back without her ever noticing. From then on, he started letting himself into her apartment whenever she wasn't home, usually during his lunch breaks. But it didn't stop there. Soon, he installed hidden cameras throughout her apartment, carefully placed so she'd never find them, just so he could watch her without her ever knowing. Over the next few months, Kenneth kept going back to check on those cameras. And on June 10th, he did it again, slipping away from work during his lunch break to sneak into her apartment. What he didn't realize was that Carolyn had decided to do the same thing that day, to head home for lunch. Because he left the office early, he had no idea she was on her way. According to his own confession, Kenneth was inside when he suddenly heard the front door unlocking. He froze, then quickly hid behind the door, just out of sight. Moments later, Carolyn stepped inside, and in that instant, when she realized someone was there, everything spiraled out of control. Kenneth panicked. He attacked her, slamming her to the ground and striking her head over and over. Then, in a frenzy, he grabbed what was nearby, a pair of scissors and a screwdriver, both items belonging to Carolyn herself, and stabbed her repeatedly, mostly in the neck. When it was over, he tried to clean up the blood with bleach, but there was far too much. So, he gathered the hidden cameras, left the apartment, and drove back to work, acting as if nothing had happened. In January 2023, Kenneth Saul was sentenced to 45 years in prison for the murder of Carolyn Byington, plus another 10 years for conspiracy to commit murder after trying to hire a fellow inmate to kill again. Before the judge handed down his sentence, Kenneth stood up and made a final statement in court. He turned toward Carolyn's family and said, "I'm sorry every day for my choices. If there were any way to undo what I've done, I would do it without hesitation. I deeply regret the pain I've caused you all. No words are strong enough to describe the horror of what I did or the suffering I brought into your lives." He also apologized to his own family, who were sitting behind him in tears. "I'm sorry for who I am, for hiding it from you all my life. The mask I wore kept you from seeing the truth. I can only imagine the shock and pain you felt when you found out." But despite his words, many who followed the case doubted the sincerity of his remorse. After all, Kenneth didn't just murder Carolyn in cold blood. He also tried to orchestrate more killings from behind bars, hoping to cover his tracks and walk free. His wife, who'd been completely unaware of his secret life, filed for divorce soon after his arrest. And while Kenneth claimed to feel guilt and regret, his actions told a different story. Not long after his sentencing, he filed an appeal, arguing that key pieces of evidence had been gathered in violation of his rights and should have been thrown out. But in late 2024, the court dismissed his appeal. Judges ruled that the investigation had been handled properly, and his conviction would stand. At this point, it's almost certain that Kenneth Saul will spend the rest of his life behind bars, a man consumed by obsession who destroyed everything in his path, including himself. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We post new true crime stories every night. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant.